We are rolling. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So,
Yep.
today is October 18th,
If you say so.
2018,
Okay.
and we're at the house of Ruth Fein on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, right? We're in the center of
That's
the city.
right.
And we're here today to talk about your father, Rabbi Isidore
Breslaw.
Breslaw.
Yeah.
Isidore Breslaw. Before we talk about Isidore and we
Yeah.
talk about your father, I would like for you, if you could please give me a little introduction of who you are.
Who am I? I'm Ruth Fein, his oldest child.
Is it you're his oldest child?
Yes, he has. My parents had two children. I have my brother, who was 3 years younger than I am, and myself. And he was one of 12.
Where was your father born? Where was Isidore born?
He was born in Kabilnik.
Where's that?
And Kabilnik is, today, I think it's in Lithuania. They were Litvakish Yidden, but it was, I think, in Poland, a part of Poland or a part of Russia. I forget which, because it's
Belarus. Poland.
that area, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And when was your father born?
1890-something, the end of the 19th century. That much I remember.
And what kind of background did he come from, his parents? Like, what kind of household was he brought
Well,
from?
he was one of 12
Right.
to begin with.
What number was he?
He was number 5 from the top. There were 4 older siblings. There had actually been 2 wives. The first wife died, and after an appropriate time, my grandfather married her cousin. And when I was a kid, my cousin and I decided to do a family tree history, really. And so we said, and my Bubba was still living, and we were interviewing her, we thought. And I asked, so how come he married his cousin? And her answer was, so typically of my father's family, well, who else was there? So.
So your father was born in the 1890s?
Yeah.
And when does he come to the United? So does he come from a religious background?
Oh yes. Oh yes.
That's what I want to know.
Oh yeah, a very traditional religious background. Yeah,
Hasidic.
his father had smicha, his grandfather had smicha. I mean, it was just a.
Did you meet your grandfather?
Oh, I knew him. Oh, I knew him.
What was his name?
God, Kayla and. Oh, don't tell anybody. I can't remember his name,
it's okay.
but I can't. It'll come to me.
Don't worry about it.
That's terrible.
So your father,
Yeah.
Isidore,
Yeah.
comes to America when?
When he was about 9 years old or so, the beginning of the 20th century. That much.
And where do they move to?
Albany, New York.
Albany.
First, I think Troy and then Albany, but that area they settled in. Because my grandfather had come to explore about 2 years previously.
Sure.
And he looked around Lower Manhattan, the East Side, Lower East Side, where the Jews then lived, and said, I'm not raising my family here. And fortunately, he had a landsman in Albany.
He had a what?
A landsman.
What's that?
That is someone from his hometown.
From his hometown.
Yeah.
And what did that person from his hometown tell him?
That Albany, there was a nice Jewish community, and that he could move into a nice neighborhood, and that they needed him because they had 9 men and they were just going to start a shul closer to that little area. So he performed the mitzvah and rented a house in the neighborhood.
Hold on, I'm just going to go plug this back in. So does your grandfather
Yeah.
come before the rest of the family? Did he leave them?
He came my memory of the story is that he came 2 years before they settled.
And then they came.
And then when he found a place in Holyoke.
Which was very typical.
Yeah, it was.
Very
And
typical.
it made sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
What I always remembered, because every time I went to New York City in the early days when my family still lived, some even on the East Side, no wonder he said he wouldn't bring his family, his children here.
Why is that?
It's too crowded and too many people.
Yeah.
And he was used to Kabilnik, which was a Kleinstädtel.
So it was in Albany. It was people from his town, basically.
Of course, yeah.
So he moves to Albany.
Yeah.
Your father grows up there.
Yeah.
What did your father ever talk to you about his childhood in Albany?
Oh, sure, a lot. Yeah, because he was, not only was he one of 12, he was the 5th from the oldest, but the 4 older were significantly enough older that they became mentors in a sense, you know, and cousins. I was only family. I don't think they knew anybody whom they were not related to. I think everybody in the, my grandfather was, you start me talking, I can't stop. So
Please, that's why we're interviewing you. That's good.
But my grandfather was famous in Albany and wherever else he had lived before, including Der Heim, for founding shuls, because he wanted to live in a neighborhood with the nicest public schools. There were no Jewish day schools in those days, but the nicest public schools. But he needed 10 men. And so he would found a shul and convince people enough, just he didn't need too many, he only needed 10. And in Albany, we once took a little trip walking from downtown up into the suburbs, and every shul on the wall it says, lists the founders, and there's my Zeta's name. That was
so he was
a shul founder.
He was a shul founder.
Yeah.
He was a shul founder. He was he like the Music Man who'd go from town to town.
That's right. That's right. In Holyoke, Massachusetts, and in Schenectady, and in Albany, and also in Troy.
So, I want to get back to Isidore.
Yes.
What kind of boy is Isidore?
What kind of boy?
What kind of boy is he?
Well, he had 4 older siblings, 2 of whom were boys, but they were considered significantly older, so that he was like the oldest
of the second
batch.
Yeah.
And I don't know the way he talks about it, but you have to take all that with a grain of salt, is that he was an excellent student, both in the Ivrit, and he had, for his generation, his age, was unusual for the kids, for boys. Girls didn't learn anything, but for boys to learn what was then modern Hebrew. It was already modern Hebrew, and he did. Yeah, exactly, yeah. And he, from the very beginning, he learned to daven, but he also learned modern Hebrew,
which is reading poetry by Bialy.
That's right, exactly. That's right.
Reading,
Yeah. So he was a highly educated Jew, by my standards.
Sure,
but he was.
And he is he getting a Jewish education in Albany?
When he came to Albany, he was already.
He was like 10.
Late teen. Well, yeah, but. He can, but the Jewish education was mostly from his father, who did I say this already? Wanted to live in a good neighborhood where the schools were good. There were no Jewish day schools, obviously, and so he always moved out, and then he had to find 9 other men, and he always did. And he started. We once took a little trip up one street in Albany, and went into every shul we found, and there were a number. And in each one, on the wall where it says founders, there was my Zeta's name.
And was your father in the First World War?
Yeah, he was in the Navy in the First World War.
Tell me about that.
He was on the USS Kentucky, which was a battleship, and which was smaller than the destroyer my husband was on in the Second World War. But because... the only thing I really remember is that's not true. He would talk about many of the same places what I should say is that my husband talked about many of the same places overseas and down the eastern coast that my father talked about, because the port cities they're still the port cities.
Was he sent to Europe at all?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Do you know where he was?
I know he was in the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. Actually, he went to Palestine.
Oh.
He was stationed, I forget whether it was in Marseille. It was in Marseille. He was stationed in Marseille. Yeah. No, that was the Second World War that he was in Marseille, but he was somewhere along the Mediterranean.
In the First World War?
The First World War.
And he went to Palestine?
And he went to Palestine. That was his first time to Palestine.
Remember what he talked?
Oh, he talked about it a lot, but only in grand terms. I mean, there was I shouldn't say little reality to what he said, but it was always with a very, in those early days, religious tenor to it. But more than that, I mean, he was a Zionist from early childhood.
From early childhood.
Yeah.
That's also, around the time of the Balfour Declaration.
Right.
And, so he spends time in the Navy in the First World War.
Yeah.
Did he see any action? Did he ever talk to you about that?
Well, yes, in the Mediterranean.
In the Mediterranean?
And all I remember, apparently, well, not apparently, because he said it, he didn't like to talk about that with his children.
What about the war?
About what happens in war. He didn't mind talking about why we went to war, and who the enemy was, and why one had to go after the enemy, but not what happened in war. He didn't like to talk about.
He didn't like to talk about that.
Yeah. Because I remember in the Second World War when my husband was in the Navy, and my father and my husband would begin talking about their different, experiences in the two different wars. And my father was on a battleship which was no bigger than the destroyer my husband was on in the Second World War.
So when your father gets back from the war, he goes to school.
He goes back to school. He had already started.
He had already started? Where did he go to school?
He went to was then Albany State Teachers College.
Okay.
Then is now State University in Albany, from which his granddaughter, my daughter, got her PhD. So,
what does he study?
He studies English and history.
And in the middle of that, it gets cut, and he goes into the war. He goes into the Navy.
Goes into the Navy, and it's not that it gets cut, because to go into the Navy, you volunteered. He didn't wait. I mean, there was no drafting in the First World War, but he didn't wait until...
No, it was a volunteer war.
It was volunteer. Yeah. But nevertheless, it reached a point where you were not exactly a volunteer when every 18-year-old you knew was going in. So, but he first of all, he wanted to be on the water, so he went into the Navy.
And when he gets back from the First World War, he goes back to school.
Back to school.
Now, when does he start his rabbinical?
Well, it was. It was not immediately after he graduated from college, because he had to make some money first.
Sure.
And to be able to go, and then he and my mother married, and she had to make the money because she'd already graduated. A woman only did. No, she got a master's, but much later.
Where did your parents meet?
In Albany State Teachers College, which is today the State University of New York in Albany.
And what year are they married?
24, I think.
What year are you born?
27. That's 27. The way I said 24, because I think that they were married 3 years before I was born.
And are you the eldest?
Yeah.
So when they get married, they're living in Albany?
No, in New York, because he's still in rabbinical school, I think.
So that's what I wanted to ask. Where does he go to rabbinical school?
He goes, first he went, this I shouldn't even say publicly.
It's fine.
And I never have, because it's not nice. And I once had the opportunity, someone was interviewing me in Shul publicly, but we were, not just me, we were going through the older members, so I was the first to be interviewed. But why did he go to JIR, was that Jewish Institute of Religion, Stephen Wise? He was not a Reform Jew. He didn't, first of all, it wasn't then a Reform Jew. Stephen Wise, as you may have known, was thought he was creating a new Jewish expression of religion for American Jews called liberal Judaism. And he believed that American Jews, because of their interaction with the Christian community, and because of the nature of America, the United States,
they need to reform themselves.
Yeah. So he went to having already gotten smicha from his uncle, who, as a kid, we always called the chief rabbi of Troy, until I finally realized there was probably only one Orthodox rabbi in all of Troy. But in our family, he was known as the chief rabbi of Troy.
So he goes to school in New York?
Yeah.
And are you born in New York?
Yeah, I was born in the Bronx.
Okay.
Yeah, for the first 11 months of my life, I lived there.
And then where did you guys move?
And then he graduated and accepted the pulpit in Waterbury, Connecticut.
What's that?
What?
The pulpit?
Pulpit. Shul, a synagogue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
where we lived till I was 6 years old.
So he got a job in Cincinnati?
No.
Where did you say?
Waterbury, Connecticut.
Connecticut, excuse me.
Yeah.
In Connecticut?
Yeah.
And he is actually working as a rabbi of a congregation.
Yeah.
It's his first posting, is that correct?
It's his only, because he gave it up after that.
Why did he give it up?
Because he hadn't been paid in 2 years, and he had a family to raise. By then, there were two.
What did he do?
The family, in my father's family, there were 12 siblings.
Right.
And whenever the next one came along and was ready for a job or to make a living or was getting married, I remember the men, the brothers and brothers-in-law, never the women, but the men, would have a meeting. And they would decide what that person would do and where he would do it. And at that time, when he had been paid in 2 years as a rabbi, the determination wisely, it was like 19, whatever, it was the beginning of the Depression, 33, 34, something, I forget, decided wisely they would set him up in business, and between all of the siblings, they always could put together enough money in those days to open a business. And the business that the family knew was decorative fabrics. And it turns out that Zeta had that business in Der Heim in the old country. And as a matter of fact, a few years ago, my brother and sister-in-law and my husband and I went and saw that town and the corner where the store had been, and all the rest of it. But but he never stopped being a rabbi in terms of what he did with his life, both technically rabbinically, because he always, we belong to an Orthodox shul in Washington, and he always did the overflow service on the high holidays, and he always was there. You know, the rabbi would say, "Okay, you take over now."
What happens after Connecticut? So do they set him up in business in Connecticut?
No, in Connecticut he had a congregation.
Right, but then he left.
He left. Then when there was no, and wisely, my older uncles, his brothers and brothers-in-law, said, you know, the only place where people get their paycheck every 2 weeks is in the nation's capital. They really, I can still remember the discussion about it. They were so, I was 6 years old, but they were so wise. And so they being the men, the women didn't count, went down to Washington, the older ones, and looked around and found the location and opened the store and helped him get started, as they did every one of his siblings and brothers-in-law.
It's amazing.
It was a family tradition. And they all took care of each other that way, always. And so I had an uncle, one of his brothers, who had been a dentist, and was in the army in the Second World War, and after the war came back, and his whole practice was gone because
I need you to look at me.
Younger dentists or older or whatever who hadn't gone to war had taken over, and I can still see the family getting together and deciding where it would be good to open a store for him, and so
the family had a little bit of capital.
Well, there were so many of them. There were 12 siblings altogether. So the brothers and the brothers-in-law, the women didn't count, but the brothers and the brothers-in-law, between them, were able to
tribe.
A tribe, and plus, you know, some of his younger uncles also participated.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now your father goes to Washington D.C.
Yeah.
You're what, 10 years old?
6 years old.
6 years old.
Yeah.
How long does he spend in D.C.?
Forever and ever.
Okay, that's what I want to talk about.
Yeah.
So apparently your father gets very involved in what we know now as AIPAC.
Right, of course. He was the founder of the precursor to AIPAC, the American Zionist Bureau, it was called, before the creation of the state.
Exactly. That's what I want
Okay.
That's what I want to talk about.
Okay. I was just old enough to remember enough about it to tell you.
Well, I'm sure you were well old enough. I mean, you were. And now, how does this bureau begin to form? How is the idea?
It's interesting because it couldn't. I remember saying to someone who was interviewing me, this couldn't happen today, and the reason is that the labor Zionists, the Mizrahi, and the general Zionists got together, and Hadassah, and they said, you know, if we want to have an impact, we can't have a representative from each organization going up there on the hill. We need one person. Now, it's not often the Jews do that, you know.
No, they all argue.
You know, this is my turf.
If you have two Jews, you have four opinions.
Exactly, but they did it, and but then I can still remember. I was a little kid, but my memory is enhanced by the fact that I think about it often enough now. I know, but said, but I'm going to, with my father-in-law, open a business because I'm never going to rely on the Jews for my income again. And so the family business had been decorative fabrics, mill-end shops. And they started in Durham, where my grandfather apparently had, and a couple of uncles had such stores.
Was it a successful business?
Oh, yeah. And today my brother runs it, and it's a very successful business. And there are a number of stores in the Washington, Virginia, and Maryland area. And you know, independently, various of my generation and the generation younger than me own stores across the country. Cincinnati, Pittsburgh,
so it's
Chicago.
A family business still.
Yeah.
And now, I want to get back to the Bureau.
Okay.
What year are we talking about when Isidore they start to form this Bureau?
Oh, geez.
Roughly. Is it before the Second World War?
I was just going to say it was certainly before the United States entered the Second World War.
It's before Pearl Harbor?
Yes, it's definitely.
Could it be that it's around the time of Kristallnacht? And
yes, of course, that's what had the final impact. My father had believed, I can remember because the conversations in our house were nothing but Jewish history. I mean, that's how I learned Jewish history. What is today Jewish history was then contemporary Jewish history.
I mean, we're talking about 1937,
right? Exactly.
39,
you know,
and you're a teenager.
It's coming close and into my teenage years, no question about it.
So
and two things: growing up in Washington, where my friends came from not only every state in the Union, then in the Union, also from many European and Asian states, countries, but you know, all over the world. So our conversations on the way to school were so damn sophisticated. It was really funny, and I think about it now. But
do you remember your father's? Because here you go.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry.
I'll stop the camera. Hold on. So apparently your father becomes successful also in his business.
Yeah.
He becomes affluential, right? He becomes kind of an influential character in the community.
In the community, yes.
DC, the Jewish community in
DC. Yeah.
And is he alone when he decides to form this bureau, or are there other people involved with him?
There was. I can think of one, maybe two other people. One was a woman, Denise Turover, who later became a national vice president with Hadassah, I know, and not the president, because in those days they thought you had to live in New York to be the president.
Right. And who's the other person?
And the other, I said one or two, and I'm trying to think. There were a couple of others. I mean, I don't want to make my father sound like the most important Jew in town, but
well, I'm just,
Yeah.
Now, while he's so he's trying to create a group of lobbyists, basically.
Oh, they were lobbyists, no question. You know, before that had really been created, and you didn't have to register as a lobbyist, in a sense.
There's a very famous incident that happened in 1939.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you, I'm going to tell you about it, and maybe it will ring a bell, and maybe you can tell me if your father was trying to help or something.
Okay.
The St. Louis.
Of course.
The boat.
The boat, I know. The ship.
The ship.
My husband was in the Navy, as was my father in the First World War. So I have to...
Because President Roosevelt was not...
No. And this was always a problem, because we were, as Jews and as Zionists, were passionate, we got to get involved. The United States has to get involved. And I can remember arguing, because I grew up in Washington, and everybody's father was somebody, an aide to some important person. And so, we thought we knew all about it.
Was your father doing anything behind the scenes to try and get these people?
Oh, yes. And that's what he did. I mean, that was his work. I mean, didn't get paid for it, but that's what he did. Yeah.
what happens when he's trying to? What I'm trying to understand is why do they create this bureau? Why?
Because they needed to have an office in Washington. They had to be like an embassy. There was no state of Israel, but they needed a representative of Palestine.
How did they get their funding to do this?
From other Jews.
So they fundraised to get this.
Oh yeah.
And this is before AIPAC.
Oh yeah. It was the precursor to AIPAC.
What's it called? The
American Zionist Bureau.
The American Zionist Bureau.
Yeah.
And they're in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And was there where were they physically based?
Yes, there was an office on 16th Street, initially in the Jewish Community Center and then in some other building, I forget, but they did have a place.
Was there any politicians that your father was close with?
Well, of course. Yeah, now I have to remember names. You're asking me.
Well, I'm asking if you remember.
I really don't remember.
Okay.
But there were there were names, and there were people who we knew were friends. And because it was Washington, I can still remember walking to school with kids, and well, my father saw Chaim Yankel today. Oh well, but my father saw. This is. It's okay.
Hello. So, any conversations that you remember in the house about what's happening in Nazi Germany?
Of course.
With the Jews?
Oh, of course. That was, what do you mean, any conversations? That was, there were two topics. One was Palestine, and the other was what was happening in the Nazis in Germany. Yeah.
Did you at the time meet any refugees?
Yes.
At that time when you were...
At the time, when I was a kid, sure. They came to our house. They stayed with us, many.
What can you tell me about that? I mean,
My really only memory, it's really funny. No, those were not, yes, the illegals. They were illegals. And we only had bedrooms on the second floor, obviously, in this, an old house, and only one bathroom for the whole, no matter how many people were staying.
Wait a second, excuse me? The water. Yeah. I'll be done soon, but we need to be, thank you so much. You remember?
Oh, yes. And I have strong memories of it. In part, I say this to you already, but I had a friend, and we used to walk to Hebrew school together. Did I tell you this? And her mother was the Washington representative of Hadassah, national representative. And we would, walking to Hebrew school together, the subject was, yesterday my father met with, and we one-upped ourselves all the time because that's what they did.
Now, when the war is over in 1945, you're 16, 17.
How old? I was born in 1927.
You're.
I was older.
You're 18.
Yeah. I was about to go to. I was in college, I think, when the war ended. Yeah.
The Jewish community. In America, the Bureau is putting a lot of energy in the refugees that are stuck in Europe.
Stuck in Europe, absolutely.
What do you know about what your father did on this topic? But I need you to think about if you remember anything specific.
Well, I don't know what specific. I know that he spent his time on the Hill, as we said, Capitol Hill. Or I should say, between that and what did they call it? It was not yet the Israeli embassy, but that was
the mission.
The missions. Yeah, I forget. Yeah, and that's what he did. That's where his life was. He and I had a friend whose mother. Did I say this already? Was the Washington representative?
Yes,
I did. So the two of us would compare notes on this stuff.
Yeah. And when the UN is voting on the partition of Palestine, is your father playing any back channel?
Yes.
With Truman administration or?
Oh yes. Yes, as we say, he was either on the Hill, or I forget what they called the White House. There was the Hill and the something, whatever there was we called the White House. Yeah. And actually, as I recall in those, no, I may be confusing it with a little later when the White House was closed and the president lived across the street.
The piano synced into
yeah.
during the Truman administration.
Okay, that was later.
Yeah,
okay.
No, but we're talking about Truman now.
Truman now, so okay, yeah. So there we are.
The piano fell.
Everything, yes.
Right? Yeah, he had to leave, right? Yeah. There's a story that happened during. When was the first time that he actually went to Israel?
Well, he went to Palestine.
When?
I'm trying to remember. 39, I think, was the first time, but I can't swear to it. Maybe it was 37. It was early. By American standards, it was early. Yeah, I forget.
Is he affiliated with, because in the Zionistic world there's...
Well, he was affiliated in Washington. Well, he founded the American Zionist Bureau, which was all the groups together. Before that, the only one who had a Washington office was ZOA. So he was the ZOA representative.
Did he know Henrietta Soul?
Yes. Yeah, she was older by, yes. I don't know, 10, 15 years, whatever, but he did know her, he had known her, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And when it comes time for the Declaration of Independence and the War of Independence, there's an embargo on Israel.
I can tell you stories about that if I only remembered them. All I remember is that Norfolk was a port where we used to both go to get things from Palestine and bring things, illegal stuff like guns and ammunition and stuff, to be sent to Palestine.
You personally?
Along with my father.
Sure.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And
where's Norfolk? Can you tell me where there's that?
Virginia. It's northern Virginia, and it's on the ocean. I mean, it's right off.
Is it near Richmond?
Yeah. Well, it's northeast of Richmond, I think.
Northeast of Richmond.
I think I'm right. Don't swear that.
What kind of things would you like? What was going on with that whole embargo? What kind of things would you take? Like, tell me a little bit about it.
I wish I remembered more. I wish I had been smart enough to write it all down at the time. I just know that there were arms involved, and I know whether it was arms, but it was also ammunition.
And bullets.
Because I remember Dad saying, "There's something in the trunk which is dangerous, so just behave." And we took that seriously enough, my brother and I, that we behaved. So, yeah. No, this was, and I can still think, I can still see some of the people involved, a small group, obviously, and no one else was supposed to know, and no one else did. I mean, even as kids, we knew enough.
I mean, he could go to jail for that.
Exactly. And we knew enough not to say anything. Yeah.
I'm trying to. When does the bureau turn into AIPAC?
AIPAC, after the creation of the state.
After the creation of the state. So was he also involved in AIPAC?
Yeah, but he left shortly thereafter.
Why?
Because it was time for him to leave already. He left, active public life in general.
What did he do after?
I don't know. What do you do? What did he do?
What did he do?
I know. So I'm saying, what do people do? He was he still remained active, but not in leadership positions. Right. He didn't believe. He really, when I think about it, and I've thought about it often, because in my own situation, I acted upon it. When you reached a certain age and you'd been a leader for long enough, it was time to say, the next generation should take over.
Sure.
And that's hard to do for many people, and many organizations have been destroyed because people don't do it.
Right.
So
he did it.
He did it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to say about your father?
And what can I say? He was also a good father. No, I'm not sure. I think my mother put up with a hell of a lot. I really did.
He was gone a lot.
He was gone a lot. He traveled a lot. There were always people in the house. She never knew who was coming for dinner.
What kind of people were in your house? Any famous people? Any famous?
Oh yeah, I still remember when Golda Meir came. Golda Meyerowitz. Meyerson. Golda Meyerson. That didn't sound
like
it. Yes. Oh yes. And oh geez, Ben Gurion was in our house. I remember all these people. I can still see them because it wasn't the house that my parents lived in by the time I was in college and then got married. It was an earlier house which they rented, but I can still see them in the front hall of that house. All these famous people who would come. Yeah. They would stay with us.
Was Menachem Begin ever in your house?
No.
No.
There was it was already, he was,
What?
Yeah, right, exactly.
What? He was what?
Right, yeah.
He wasn't accepted into those circles, Menachem Begin?
Well, they knew him, and it's interesting. On the one hand, he was, but not on the inner circle. I mean, he had his own circle.
Sure. So your father's more affiliated with the mainstream,
but the general Zionists, but also the labor
agency.
Yeah, but the labor Zionists.
Weitzman, Ben Gurion, Golda.
Oh yeah. I remember when Weitzman was our house, when Golda was in our yes, and Golda was in our house. Yeah.
And this is before the state was
before the state. Oh yeah, after the state, they stayed in state. They didn't stay in people's homes.
Because they were Golda was
Golda Meir.
What about Teddy Kollek?
When I met him, I remember years ago on a trip to Israel, meeting him and saying, "I know you." I said, "I know. We've met. We met in Washington, and I don't remember the occasion. I know I knew him too."
Because he was in charge of the New York office.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. So I didn't.
He was the guy who was one of the main guys who was buying weapons.
Yes, that's how I knew him. And he and my father would go to Virginia. Now it's okay to say that.
Right.
And that's where they would get a lot of the weapons. Don't ask me how.
And also in Burbank, Al Schwimmer.
Yeah, out there. I'm sure I remember it. Yeah.
Does that name ring a bell to you?
Yes, it does, Al Schwimmer. Yeah.
He was tried.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
A very sad story what happened to him.
Yeah.
But I'm sure your father knew Teddy Kollek.
Oh, of course. And Teddy Kollek stayed at our house. That's what I remember, yeah.
It was a very exciting time.
It was.
46, 47,
I remember the first time I went to Israel after the state was either in 49 or 50 or whatever. And seeing, I don't know if it was Teddy Kollek, somebody, and he looked at me and he said, "I know you." And I said, "Yes, you used to stay in our house when you came to Washington." That's... And all my Boston, I forget, 49, I was living in Washington. I forget where I was living. But anyway, all my buddies I was traveling with were so impressed.
Ruth, I think we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Excellent. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about, to say about your father before?
You're concentrating on his, I would call it his professional life, or his Zionist life, really, not even just his professional life.
Well, his professional life as well, if you'd like to add something.
Yeah, but no, well, because he was a rabbi before, in Connecticut, before he,
before he moved to D.C., he was a rabbi, yeah. We talked about that. Yeah. Did he ever continue his rabbinical career after?
Never with the congregation, but he always did. Whatever shul he belonged to. No, he did the high holiday. What did they call it?
He would do the high holidays.
Yeah, the extra services they would have. He never gave up, and I put it that way because we used to discuss it because he had former colleagues who also were no longer practicing rabbis, but who didn't do anything rabbinic anymore.
Sure.
And he continued to use the title, and to do things, to be a rabbi.
Rabbi Isidore?
That's it. That's it.
And how do you pronounce the last name?
Breslaw.
Rabbi Isidore
Breslaw.
Mm-hmm. And when did Isidore pass away?
Oh, Gott in Himmel. If you think I remember. Okay. I was married and had all my children by then, I think. No, wait a minute. I think one of my kids, his name, it's a grandchild was named after him. I mean, she's a girl, so her name is not Izzy.
What would his friends call him? Izzy or?
Izzy. Izzy or Iz.
Or Iz.
And then he got older, it was Iz. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. I'm going to stop.
Okay.